My name's Deborah Green. I'm the president of the local Audubon chapter, which is how I was invited to be part of the planning committee. And it happens that I'm a former entomologist from way back. So I've found this very fascinating, this whole conference, and as I trust you are. So let me introduce our first speaker, who you've already heard, fantastic talk earlier, Dr. Lou Guillette. And actually, in the interest of time, since we've already heard his introduction, I'll just turn it over to him.
So when they asked me to give a second talk this morning, I decided I'd do something slightly different. And it's still on topic because it was water. And one of the things that I don't think we appreciate is that almost every time we have pollution by pesticides, especially associated with agriculture, et cetera, we also have basically pollution with nutrients. And so the title today is The Other Global Pollutant Nitrogen Contamination. And I just want to show you a few things that we've been doing over the last few years to try and bring this to attention. I actually got onto this by this article that came out in Science magazine. As many of you know, the two major science magazines in the world are Science and Nature. There's some political issues and all that, but we'll ignore that for a minute. The fact is, this was a story that came out, a two-pager, basically arguing that there's a second global pollutant. Of course, the first global pollutant we're all worried about is CO2. The second global pollutant is nitrogen. It ends up that the natural system fixes a fair amount of nitrogen. But since World War II, and learning how to do nitrogen fixation ourselves, basically human activity is 1.5 times the natural activity taking place literally in the whole global nitrogen pathway. Most of the culprits associated with this are fertilizers, fossil fuels, and animal production. Why does that matter? Well, it ends up that we all know there are ecological impacts to nitrogen fertilizers. I used to live on a little pond up in Gainesville when I was at the University of Florida, and some of the people around the pond loved their fancy lawns and would have the green chemical people come. Every time we would actually get one of these small thunderstorms in Gainesville, of course, we'd have all this runoff coming off the lawns. And literally 2 days later, there'd be an algal bloom in the pond. And they couldn't figure out what was going on. And I finally said to them, well, let me just give you a little basic agriculture. You know, I mean, it's very simple. This is just a distribution. And it's interesting when you look at the scale, you actually look at it and you say it's pounds per acre. That doesn't sound like a big deal. But there's a good part of the country where we're actually, look at the last figure. It's 0 to 5, 5 to 10, 10 to 50, and then 50 to 700 pounds of nitrogen fertilizer per acre. And of course, the fact is there's no way in the world the plants can accumulate that amount of fertilizer in any reasonable way, which means most of it runs off. And that's one of the reasons why we got giant dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico, et cetera, et cetera. So we all know this. And we actually have a reason why we even regulate nitrate in drinking water. It's regulated at 10 parts per million because of methemoglobinemia. This was actually a disease that came about right after World War II, when in fact we were using fertilizer and the advent of modern baby formula. We were actually telling women that they didn't need to actually breastfeed, you could just make formula. Women started making formula with well water. The well water was contaminated with nitrates. The baby developed blue baby syndrome. This is not the hemoglobin-based one in the sense of mismatch in genes. This is the hemoglobin one in which nitrite, which is generated from nitrate, we take nitrate in, it's converted to nitrite. Nitrite binds to hemoglobin, and when it binds to hemoglobin, it prevents the uptake of oxygen. So it's binding to the heme groups, the iron groups, on the hemoglobin and not allowing oxygen to bind. We also have what we call rusty blood syndrome in fish. Same deal. Basically, fish that are exposed to nitrate-laden waters develop the same disease if they don't end up dying. So this actually started me thinking on a completely different frame of mind, because if you're binding to heme groups, that is iron groups, that are in hemoglobin, that is what we carry oxygen in our blood, there's a whole series of enzymes in our bodies that do the same thing. That is, they have heme groups that they're using for oxygen transport as part of their function, not by giving oxygen to our bodies, but by having enzyme function. And so, one of the main pathways is steroidogenesis. And this is a big fancy slide, and it's actually a cartoon for what goes on. But the take home is, the way you make testosterone and estradiol is you basically have to start with enzymes that are P450 enzymes. So I asked if nitrate is in all this water and it binds to heme groups, and those enzymes are essential for sex steroids, could we in fact see some of this? So, really quickly, here are some of the lakes we work on in Florida. There's in fact the average nitrate levels that we find there. Lake Apopka only happens to be in the middle. We have many much more eutrophic lakes in Florida, also agriculturally based. You can see the one lake, this is our reference light. This is Lake Woodruff National Wildlife Refuge. It's the one place I can go and see through the water. The water's clear. In fact, remember, Florida lakes were oligotrophic up until about 40 years ago. Oligotrophic in the sense that they were sandy bottom lakes. Remember, the soil in Florida is incredibly poor historically, except for in the swampy areas. Why? We're old sand dunes. This is all sand dunes on limestone. The only reason you have rich soil is where swamps are. You actually hold the water, things die, builds up in the thing, and you get nice soil. Why do we drain the swamps? Why do we actually drain the swamps around the lakes? That's where the best soil is, okay? That's part of the whole farming mentality. All along the east coast of the United States, it's the same deal, especially in the southeast. We have sand, poor soils, and so we have lots of fertilizer. So, trying not to belabor the point, basically what we did was I just looked at my alligators and looked at testosterone and compared it to the various lakes. So we looked at average testosterone, average nitrate in the water, and the crazy part was we got this reasonably powerful statistic. On our square says that basically this line represents 48% of the variance we see there. But remember, this one way up in the top there, that's Lake Woodruff. That's the only lake that's oligotrophic. So we took it out of the relationship, and here's the relationship between testosterone in my animals and the amount of nitrogen that's in these lakes in the water. Now the crazy part is, this is incredibly powerfully statistically, and this explains 90% of the variance. This is impossible. As a biologist, I looked at this and went, quite bluntly, bullshit, okay? That correlation is impossible. This is so perfect. These lines are lining up. So we started to say, okay, there has to be, I mean, let's test it. I mean, it at least is testable. I don't know if this is real. So, quickly, what we did was a whole series of studies. We actually took cells in culture. These happen to be human testis cells. We basically gave them nitrate. Basically, we knocked out their ability to actually produce hormone, steroid hormones. We took frogs. We stuck them there. We can go in, surgically remove the oocytes. We talked about the eggs this morning. This is a standard procedure we do. You can do minor surgery, pop out a few of the eggs, clip them off, because the frog has this big mass of eggs, kind of like if you ever opened up a fish. Pop them off. We can separate the eggs. We can put them in culture, so we don't actually have to do anything to the frog. We put in nitrate, boom, 50% reduction in steroidogenesis. They don't make estradiol. They don't make progesterone, which is pregnancy hormone. So we basically went and said, okay, dove to the bottom of some of our springs here in Florida, collected water, collected basically the mosquito fish that were living there, little viviparous fish, and sure enough, if you come from a spring that has elevated nitrate, then you in fact have half of the testosterone that you're supposed to have and half the pregnant females you're supposed to have. But now here's the kicker. U.S. drinking water limits are 10 parts per million nitrate nitrogen. I'm reporting that basically anything over 18, we're having a measurable effect. That sounds like it's twice the water. No, sorry, we're doing this reporting as a nitrate, which actually the limit means is 45. We're at half drinking water limits. And we're already seeing a 50% reduction in fertility, and we're actually seeing a half reduction in steroid production. All of this has actually been published, by the way. And so what we now know is that sure enough, if you expose nitrate, you knock out two critical components of steroid hormone synthesis, which are essential for reproduction and fertility. It's there. And just to belabor the point, you can actually take frogs, you can put them in the water for 7 days, and then you can actually take out those ovaries again, you can culture them, and what you find is a 50% or more reduction in the synthesis. So it only takes 7 days to shut the system down. This is not a developmental issue like I was talking about this morning. And in fact, plasma levels are the same. What we now know is that not only does it affect the gonad, it also affects the liver. Here's an interesting observation. It ends up the way you basically get rid of contaminants, specifically pesticides, from your body, is your liver metabolizes those. You have specific enzymes to do that. Those enzymes are P450 enzymes. How do they detoxify? They use oxygen, radicals, and heme groups in order to do that. So what we're actually doing is knocking down synthesis, but we're also knocking down at the same time the ability to clear the contaminants that we're actually exposed to. So it's a double whammy. So our alligators don't even have to be put in the toilet, okay, to actually get a bad environment. The fact is the environment itself is the toilet. They're thus the cartoon, okay? The fact is that these algal blooms, all this stuff with duckweed, you see all these ponds, those ponds were unique in Florida up until just a few years ago. So this stuff has been published. We continue to do some of it. We have a couple of other studies we're in the middle of. We have not been able to get funding for this. You can imagine the firestorm because this is a multi-billion-dollar industry. And the perception is that nitrate is not a human health effect if it's under 10 parts per million. I did not put up the stuff today in which there's a physician that works off the Mississippi. He's actually finding that associated with nitrate, you can look at drinking water limits. Most communities in the middle part of the country spend millions and millions every year trying to keep nitrate below 10 parts per million. In fact, in the spring, it's almost impossible. They end up just paying fines because they can't do it. As an aside, when we started doing these experiments at the University of Florida, I decided to test our drinking water coming through the water at the university. One day, it was 1 part per million. Next day, it could be 10 parts per million. In other words, we actually had to make our own water to do these experiments because what we in fact realized was that we couldn't take water out of the tap and assume that we had 0 parts per million. So already our high dose was 10 parts per million. That was drinking water limit, and that's what was the control. So just to give you a different spin on what we talked about this morning. Thank you all.
Your second speaker is Dr. Boyce Thorne Miller, the Science and Policy Coordinator at the Northwest Atlantic Marine Alliance. Prior to joining NAMA, she was a consultant for several national and international NGOs on coastal environmental issues and biodiversity. And prior to that, she held positions as senior scientist with SeaWeb and Friends of the Earth and staff scientist with the Ocean Society. Her work has included public oversight of scientific review processes in agencies including the Environmental Protection Agency, NOAA, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Army Corps of Engineers, State Department, and the Department of Defense. And she has an MS in Oceanography from the University of Rhode Island.
I want to talk about pesticides in the marine environment, but I want you to remember Lou's map of nitrogen, because nitrogen is you know, sort of starts this whole thing. So the sources of nutrients and pesticides which come together into the ocean from land-based activities are sewage, agriculture, forestry, lawn care and golf courses, and eradication of unwanted species on public and private lands. And the routes of flow into the ocean are, we all know about drainage basin inflow, through the water system, but there's also a lot of atmospheric deposition of both nutrients and pesticides. So agriculture can be right on the water. This is Chesapeake Bay, where agriculture is a very significant input into Chesapeake Bay and has caused severe pollution due to nitrogen enrichment. And that's what they all talk about all the time. But there's also, think about it, with the nitrogen come the herbicides and the pesticides. Forestry also uses these products, and this is just an example of a hillside that drains right into an estuary. And lawn care, we're all familiar with the battles against lawn care chemicals, and golf courses, Pebble Beach, right there on the ocean, isn't that wonderful? All those fertilizers and pesticides go right in. And unwanted species eradication is something that we really have to think about. People just give that a pass too often. They can be a source of really important problems to the species that drain they drain into the ocean. And atmospheric deposition. I'll just mention briefly, mercury is often thought of as the heavy metal mercury comes in through the water drainage, but actually mercury is all over the ocean, way out in the middle, because of atmospheric deposition. And there are a lot of other chemicals, and pesticides included. So I'm just an example, since this is a popular pesticide at this particular conference, neonicotinoids, and we all know about the bee colony collapse, but the EU already recognizes that it goes beyond that, gets into the waterways, it's persistent, as we've been told, and aquatic invertebrates. It's not insects in the marine environment, but our little crustaceans, zooplankton, are obviously being hit. Nobody's measuring it, nobody's looking at it, probably won't for a while, but all these modern pesticides are getting there. And it's something we have to start thinking about. Okay, they're also in the sea, there are things going on that add to this. 80% of the pollution in the ocean comes from land, but the other 20%, or maybe a little less, comes from activities in the sea. And really important ones are the large-scale aquaculture. And I know that if you're interested in food, you hear a lot about, well, aquaculture is going to save the fisheries. No, it isn't. Aquaculture contributes to the problems of fish. It pollutes with both pesticides that are used in the aquaculture, especially the large-scale aquaculture cages, and also there are escapes and disease, and there's all sorts of things. So aquaculture contributes to the downfall of fisheries. It's not a savior. Contaminated sediments, most of that originated from land, but there it is in the ocean as a continued source of pollution from these highly contaminated sediments, and also antifoulants on ships and waterfront activities, and various industries that go on polluting along the waterfront. So the large-scale aquaculture, the sort of the poster child is Norwegian salmon, and continues to be developed more and more densely, and continues to cause all sorts of disease problems. The wild salmon are practically non-existent. They've either interbred or been knocked out by disease. And you may hear about organic aquaculture salmon. That isn't really any better. Maybe they use less chemicals, but it's still a threat to the wild populations. Antifoulants from ships, cargo ships, a lot of ship traffic, and so there's a lot of these chemicals are very persistent and are found in marine organisms. And dredging and disposal of contaminated sediments just stirs everything all up again. And anything that might be clinging onto those sediments and staying out of the biological system is actually resuspended and redissolved. So what happens when first nutrients go in? Phytoplankton blooms occur. They do not suck up oxygen, but what happens is they get very dense. The predation does not keep up with it, so there's a lot of death, falls to the bottom. That's where the oxygen gets sucked up with bacterial activity on these plants. So it's often reported in the news the wrong way. Same with submerged vegetation, particularly in estuaries. Chesapeake Bay used to be, very highly populated with underwater seagrass meadows. And then they practically disappeared. I understand a few are coming back. We don't know if that's permanent or not. As the oxygen is depleted, the fish and other species that can swim will move out of the area. Other things have to stay there because they're anchored in the ocean, in the bottom, and they will die. We don't know anything about behavioral effects of the both nutrients but especially the pesticides that come with them. And the dead zones, there was reference to the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. Chesapeake Bay has its dead zone. My concern, and I never see much about this, is that the dead zones, okay, they are set up by nutrient stimulating growth that then dies and decays. But the pesticides that come with it are going to keep that growth from coming back if there's any attempt to recover these systems. And sure enough, there have been more restrictions on the input of nutrients, and people expected to see some of these, especially smaller dead zones, start recovering. No, they're not. And this is just a global map of where serious dead zones occur. You can see the East Coast is littered, the Gulf of Mexico is littered, Baltic Sea. Often you'll hear the Black Sea referred to as a dead zone, but that's completely natural. That's always been that way. It has to do with the geological structure, so that's gotten mixed up a little bit. The Gulf of Mexico dead zone changes in size from year to year, from season to season, but it seems to be a pretty permanent thing. Chesapeake Bay, you can see the red area. That was at its peak dead zone. It also fluctuates. So the pesticides, as they come into the marine ecosystems, some of it stays in the water column, but a lot of it goes into the sediments, much higher concentration in the sediments. And then at the very surface is something called the sea surface microlayer, where things can be concentrated 100, 1,000-fold. And they're hard to measure and nobody really looks there. But the significant thing about that is so many species have floating reproductive stages, floating eggs, embryos. And in that sea surface microlayer are very high concentrations of things like pesticides. Nobody's really looking at them anymore. So I think that as we talk about nutrient pollution, we need to have that pesticide factor in along with it, because they are delivered together. And of course, they end up in the food chain, in the organisms themselves. Again, people have kind of stopped looking at since the DDT years, and they found it everywhere, and they found tumors, and they found all sorts of health problems arising because of those old pesticides, organochlorides? Yeah. Anyway, so they haven't been looking so much, but the other pesticides that were supposed to just, I don't know, some magically disappear after 4 days or something like that. That was the advertisement anyway. Of course they don't. They break down into other chemicals. Some of them just really don't break down. And sure enough, wherever they're looked for, they are found. And that includes here is an example of a whole issue of Marine Pollution Bulletin that talked about the Great Barrier Reef. Well, atrazine all over the Great Barrier Reef, in the sediments, in the seagrass, and in the fish. Deep water fish, way down in the deepest parts of the ocean, in Monterey Canyon for one, they're finding them there too. Not only the old pesticides, which, as Lou pointed out, are still around and will be for a very long time, but also the new pesticides are showing up. Octopus, very deep water octopus have them. So it's just a matter of looking for them, and there they are. So there are a number of relevant ocean sort of laws and policies that although most of you are not marine focused, let me just leave you with this message. Sometimes these laws and policies can be used to say, okay, the stuff that's happening on land, these chemicals that are being used on land are violating laws that protect the ocean, or are in violation of policies like the National Ocean Policy, which talks about ecosystem-based management. And those can be used to work backwards to try to stem the flow from land. And finally, back to our lovely little seagrass bed with the fish very happily swimming through it. And hopefully they won't be gone, but they're on their way out.
Quite a few years ago, we worked with Dr. Richie Shoemaker, who did work on the Pocomoke and the Chesapeake Bay, and he was finding copper from agricultural runoff from chicken farms that he felt was causing the toxic algae blooms in the Chesapeake Bay area. And I don't know if anybody can address that, or if you know anything about what's happening. Maybe somebody could address the toxic algae bloom issue and related to pesticides and other kinds of metals.
Copper, I don't know about copper. The nitrogen and phosphorus from the chicken and pig farms are widely blamed for Chesapeake Bay. And there have been a number of measures. I don't know how strong the measures are. They haven't cleaned up Chesapeake Bay for sure. And I'm sure there are a lot of other chemicals that go in with it, and those have not been looked at. You know, the seagrass beds and the marshes are seen as really important filters for some of this pollution that goes in. And yet nobody looks at herbicides, which get flooded in the spring along with fertilizers. And what does that do to those species that we're relying upon to filter it out? So you asked about toxic blooms. That whether you end up with a toxic species of phytoplankton depends in large part on the temperature of the water, the kinds of species that are favored. Dinoflagellates is the category of organisms that produce those toxins. And in cooler, perhaps cleaner waters, diatoms tend to be dominant, but once you start warming things up, you might get more dominant dinoflagellates, some of which are toxic and some aren't.
We've also, this morning when I spoke about the combinational studies, where we're using artificial neural network analyses to try to understand these complex mixtures. So you are absolutely correct. One of the interesting things is that phosphorus, phosphates, and nitrates are critical for algal growth. But one of the things we're also finding is that metals, copper, iron, also play a critical role in specific dinoflagellates growing. And so one of the things that we actually found, and this is one of the reasons we did the study, is what is the critical iron, what's critical temperature, what's critical, they combine together. Because the fact is, people would actually say, oh, but there's plenty of copper here, there's plenty of iron. You say, yes, but you don't have the right temperature, you don't have the right microorganisms present. So this goes back to this idea that if you're only studying one thing, you know, if all you're interested in is nitrate, or you're only interested in copper, you're going to miss the boat. I mean, there are certainly elements that you will understand, the system, but you'll never understand the complexity of the ecosystem we're dealing with, whether it's the ecosystem of a human body or it's the ecosystem of a bay. And so we also now, because I'm based at a marine lab, we try and understand that for marine mammals, for sea turtles, or alligators in the marine environment. We're doing all of these things, but it's very complex, but it doesn't mean we should just be ignoring those complexities.
So this is related to Lake Apopka. A couple of years ago, I don't know if I think you had already left then, but in their great effort to try and make Lake Apopka great for sport fishermen, they dredged the Magnolia Park boat ramp and the Winter Garden boat ramp. And there were people working out there, because we did toxic tours out there, and we saw people working out there with the dredged sediments up on the land. I don't know if you saw it when they were doing the dredging, but I was very concerned because the people were not wearing any protective equipment. And I was very concerned because of, toxins in the sediment. So I don't know if you want to,
let me tell you a story. I'll give you a Lake Apopka story. So for any of you who have actually, I don't know how much history you know of Lake Apopka, and if you went on the tour, you got some of it. But here's an interesting observation. In the 1960s, there were 20-some fish camps around Lake Apopka in the 40s, 50s, and early 60s, worth multi-million dollars. This was before Orlando was Orlando, before they even knew. Orlando was a crossroads between 301 and something else. So the fact is that you go out there, you can still see the old piers, the old pilings from these fish camps. They're there. And so through most of the 90s and most of the early 2000s, we were the only boats out there, us and a commercial catfish fishermen. So that's why we never ate catfish from Florida. But we would go out, and if we were taking sediment samples and we would do it with DEP and stuff, we'd all wear no-mech suits and the whole routine. So the point is that there are, in fact, some of the areas, as you know, on the old farmlands, there's sites where we weren't measuring contaminants in part per billion. We were measuring contaminants in part per thousand. So the fact is you could have actually taken some of these sediments and redistributed them onto the land, and they would have actually worked as pesticides again. I mean, it was that concentrated. So that's part of the legacy. That's not the whole lake. And the double legacy of Lake Apopka is that not only do you have the farmlands in the north and the east and the west and the south, but in the south also around Gordon Neck Springs, of course, you have the Tower Chemical Company. That was a mom and pop, or at least it's described as a mom and pop formulation company, which did not make chemicals themselves. They made formulations specifically for the citrus industry, the truck farms, et cetera. So the take home is that we used to laugh all the time and say that, the graduate students who hadn't had their kids weren't supposed to be hanging off the front of the airboat doing the stuff. They'd let guys like me that already had our kids so that we could do that. Kidding aside, I do think that there are sites in Lake Apopka where if you're going to handle the sediments and do all of that. Now, I still go out there every year. We still muck around. I've waded in, the water up to my chest out there, wading into gator nests. And you do think about it. You do think about the fact of all the stuff that's out there. But again, I need to put this in perspective. There are lots of sites around the world that they're actually trying to clean up. And they're basically trying to get to Lake Apopka levels. So, I think we have to put it in perspective. I'm not belittling Lake Apopka. Lord, no. I've literally spent too many years out there working. I know that it's an issue. And so it's a combination of, are we talking toxic? That is, are we talking lethal? The answer is most of the values out there are close, okay? Lethal to an embryo? Well, maybe for some embryos and some women, if they got a high enough dose, that would be a problem. Eating the fish? No, it's not toxic in the sense of killing you. Lethal, I should say. Does it have a potential to alter health? The answer is yes.
My name is Maggie Sergio, and I'm the founder and director of Island Watch Conservation Science. And Island Watch is a grassroots nonprofit that I started after I began to learn and discover that the business of island eradications and the war on invasive species, which is the next market opportunity that's being exploited by the pesticide industry. And it's sold as conservation. And when you've got people like Nature Conservancy that takes millions from Monsanto, Dow, and DuPont promoting these projects, I'm up from the San Francisco Bay Area. I'm up in Marin County, just north. And I became involved in the Farallon Islands Mouse Eradication Project and wrote several articles calling out the fraudulent science in the environmental impact statement, which was written by the sole source contractor that is going to get the business. There's one firm in Santa Cruz, California, that is a nonprofit that comes in with helicopters, and they have pilots from New Zealand that do this insane practice of dropping incredible amounts of brodifacoum or compound 1080 on islands around the world. And I get a little emotional, I'm sorry, because my background's wildlife rehab, and I've seen what happens.
I actually worked in New Zealand for years, so I know
You
exactly
did.
what
You
you're
know
talking
what?
about.
Okay.
Yes, because it's a whole other story.
Yeah, that's another, because the government, it's always back to the money, because the government has a financial interest in New Zealand in promoting these poison drops. So what I've been able to do up in San Francisco is the Farallon Islands project is delayed. They're actually quite embarrassed because, and I'm just amazed that U.S. Fish and Wildlife looks the other way. Well, and so when I bring up the issue, this is going to get into the surrounding ecosystem, into the marine environment, and you're going to contaminate the food web. They look at me like I have 3 heads. And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on the impacts of anticoagulant rodenticides to the marine environment, particularly coral reefs, because they have a project planned for the most southerly coral reef in the world, Lord Howe Island, which is between New Zealand and Australia. From what I've been reading, it's never been tested on coral reefs, the impacts from rodenticides. So I wanted to get your thoughts on this.
So a couple of things. You've identified a really interesting caveat. And what I mean by that is that this goes back to what I've been arguing probably all day, is that if you focus on one thing, then in fact you lose track of everything else. So for example, I'll tell you that really quick, I literally do endangered species reproduction work as well. So I wear a bunch of different hats, and we worked on really weird animals. And one of the most important one is the New Zealand tuatara. It's actually the oldest protected species on Earth. No one in this room has ever heard about it. It looks like a lizard. It was actually first picked up by Captain Cook when he sailed through basically Stevens Strait. And the tuatara, so it looks like an iguana. It's not. It's the 4th group of reptiles. It's the Rhynchocephalians. It was actually protected in 1898. The problem is that when rats and mice basically get on the islands, these animals have a 5-year reproductive cycle. It takes 5 years to generate just 6 or 7 offspring. And so they also live over 100 years. So they're incredibly long-lived species. So leading all up to this, New Zealand basically got into this idea that they had species that were unique to the world. The only place they were left were on some of these offshore islands, and they had to figure out how to eradicate them. So I actually, believe it or not, was part of some of the arguments that took place in New Zealand about the fact that we couldn't just nuke these for mice, because the fact is, as I said this morning, an ovary is an ovary, a testis is a testis. These systems, like we just talked about hemoglobin, every organism that uses hemoglobin basically uses hemoglobin. It's basically an iron-based phenomenon. So what about chemicals that actually have effects on specifically rodents? They don't just have specific effects on rodents. Now, the question becomes, most of these are actually being dropped as pellets, or they're being dropped as something so the animal eats it, gets into the marine environment. Is the old idea is dilution's the answer to pollution, right? The fact is that, yeah, probably for seals and maybe otters and the rest, if they're in the water, maybe they aren't exposed to high enough levels to kill them. But that doesn't mean that it's not high enough levels that it compromises them in such a way that they now become open for infections and all these other things that are supposed to take place. The take home is that you've just given is you're absolutely correct. The problem is no money to do the research. Nobody's asked the question, or if they've asked the question, there's so many vested interests that it's almost impossible to get in and do the work. So That's why we need NGOs. That's why we need people like you, to be blunt.
Thank you. Well, that's been my experience, is the science has been extremely exaggerated about the impacts. Yes, yeah. You know, for example, on the Farallon Islands, these mice, nobody knows how long they've been there. They've probably been there since Sir Francis Drake showed up. Yep. No one knows for sure. And the ashy storm petrel, which is one bird that U.S. Fish and Wildlife says, oh, we got to save this bird, it's at risk. They just said it's not at risk. They denied it endangered species status. What they're claiming is, and this is the most bizarre thing I've heard, but they've used it in other island projects around the world, that these mice are artificially attracting, on average, 6 burrowing owls a year. And I call them non-native Nazis, they think the burrowing owls should not be there. On some occasions, yes, these owls do eat these petrels, but it's a low percentage of their diet. So the solution is coming with helicopters and 22 pounds of brodifacoum per acre. And there's no oversight, and it's done in the name of conservation. And that's the.
Can I make one other quick comment? I mean, I work a lot with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Like most of the government agencies we deal with, there are world-class scientists with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the U.S. EPA, the FDA, whatever. The problem is the top of those bureaucracies are all political. And so most of them are actually in a battle, 2 battles. First, many of them are actually held under clauses that if they actually speak out about certain things, then they actually lose their jobs. The second part is that, or what happens is they're just not allowed to study a certain topic because they get put onto a different topic. So I think the important part is that, the other important part is that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has as many branches as most big corporations. So half the time the right hand and the left hand doesn't know what they're doing. So you get people who only specialize in these eradication programs. They're only focused in on rats and mice. And they use these excuses. It was the same. Believe me, it's. I don't care whether we're talking island eradication, we're talking about smoking, it's the same arguments that are used all over the world, because if it worked in one place, they assume it's going to work in the next place. And
that's the interesting thing. The failure rate for these projects for mice is 38%. Oh, yeah. Desiceo Island, they did a couple years back. That was a miserable failure. You heard nothing about the collateral damage or bykill, and now there's 2 other islands in the Caribbean, right off Puerto Rico, that are planned. I'm involved in a huge FOIA request on this business relationship they have, and in reading the internal emails, it's easier. They think that they're going to have this one company, Island Conservation. They'll have a much easier time from a regulatory perspective in the Caribbean than they will in Hawaii. But this is an ecological mafia, what this is.
This is a really serious problem everywhere, really, but the analyses that are needed to decide whether a species is really causing a problem, for one thing. Changes in species, those of us who had ecology a long time ago learned that ecosystems change and species change, and that's part of an ecosystem's ability to adapt to the environmental changes, especially the ones that we're causing. So I think that a lot of these wars against quote invasive species are really misguided, and there needs to be some system that really looks scientifically at which species do we really have to be concerned about. Islands are particularly a problem, as you know, in Hawaii. Because you have a lot of species coming in. It's a limited area. Species can't move around as much. So other species will decline considerably, and people will get very alarmed. Oh my gosh, this new species is causing that one to go away, and it gets very emotional. And we need to try to take the emotion out of it. I know that you work with Mary McAllister also out in California. Yes, yeah, she's a friend of mine also. And these are battles that are going on the West Coast a lot. And they're important battles. And stick with it.
My name is Benny McLean. I live in Clermont. Okay. I moved from Bartow, Florida to Clermont in 1954. My dad a few years ago. I'm in the citrus business, organic citrus in Clermont, and my dad and I used to go fishing in Lake Apopka. Okay.
You know better than I do then.
Okay. We started in 1954, and we went out of Montverde. There was a fish camp right there.
Yep.
The lake was entirely full of hyacinths.
Used to put my boat in there every night. Exactly.
All right. So I am curious of when the demise of Lake Apopka started, and I want to tell you a story, okay? And I'm not 100% positive the date because we've been talking about it for many, many years. I believe, now if you ever went fishing in Lake Apopka, it was full of hyacinths. Okay, hyacinths were every bit that high, and the whole entire lake was covered with them, all right? And there was 26 fish camps, and the reason there was 26 fish camps is because if you lived on the west side of Lake Apopka, if the wind was coming out of the west, you could find the little trails and go out and fish. If the wind was coming out of the east, you had to go around to the east side and fish. Okay, I believe it was 1956. We had started practicing football in Clermont, little old toddler, and this was in August, and there was a terrible, terrible smell, okay, that drifted from the lake, from Winter Garden, and there was a juice plant in Winter Garden also, so we all were used to smelling the odor coming out of the juice plant, but this was a very distinct odor, and everybody was like, I wonder where is that coming from? Now, you got to remember, back then Clermont was 3,000 people, and there was 300,000 acres of citrus all in this area, right here where we're standing. Okay. All right. You could go out there in Lake Apopka, and you would see ducks, you'd see snakes, you'd see gators, everything, all up on these hyacinths. I mean, they lived out on all this stuff. All right. So my dad and I, we talked for a month or so. I wonder what that smell is. Well, let's go fishing. Okay, so we go to Montverde, and we get there where you can look over the lake, and the whole entire, I don't remember how many acres it is, all the hyacinths were dead. Okay, we got a boat, and we started out in it, and there were dead gators, there were dead snakes, there were dead birds, there were dead ducks, and the smell was so bad that we actually came back, and nobody could fish.
Yeah.
All right.
Do you know what ballpark when this was?
It was, if I remember right, it was the summer of 56. Okay. So my dad started inquiring, trying to figure out what had happened, because this affected a lot of people, just the smell. Come to find out, I don't know if it was the county, the state, or the federal government. They sprayed that whole entire lake with Agent Orange.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
To kill the hyacinths.
That's right.
All right. All those hyacinths turned upside down and floated for about 6 months, and then they sunk to the bottom. The lake was sprayed twice with Agent Orange. Okay. So I've always taken the position. I didn't hear your talk. Wasn't on the tour yesterday, but I've always taken the position that now the government said, "Oh boy, we got a scapegoat." The farmers up there on the north end farming this lake. Okay, guess who got blamed for everything? The farmers. I've never read, never heard anything about that lake was sprayed with Agent Orange.
Well, I'll tell you
I'll leave it at that.
Nope. No, I'll tell you a couple of things. You've given me a little information. We know that in 56 or 57, I was told, that there had actually been, well, two things happened. The first is that in the late 40s, they diked off the north part of the marsh. And so the whole, what we think of is Zellwood Farms and all those areas up there were, in fact, at one point, wetlands. And so they were, as you know, I mean, and then they diked it off. And as we were talking earlier, Florida's supposed to be sand and sand dunes. And so the good soil was actually in the marsh. So they diked it off, they cleared it out. The interesting part was, my understanding was, I was told that when that started, the way that they actually started farming here, as you know, there was citrus. But they wanted to do what, in fact, was traditionally muck farming. and muck farming required a fair amount of water, and that's why, of course, you do them by lakes, and that the pumps were basically chuck full because you can't pump water very effectively when you actually have lakes full of hyacinths. My understanding was, I was told that no one ever told me who did it, and still it's all these lessons, no one knows who did it, that basically they started treating the lakes at that time. And it wasn't just that lake. It was Griffin. It was the southern part of Lake Okeechobee. As you know, I mean, you go to Moonshine Bay even today, it's hyacinth as far as you can see. It's beautiful. It's the easiest part to get lost in the middle of the night out there. So 1980, the Tower Chemical Company is the spill.
I'm in the citrus business.
Yep.
I know
Nope.
all about
Yeah.
Tower Chemical.
So no, I'm saying is 1980, Tower Chemical basically had the spill. And everyone says, oh, no, the lake problems are all 1980. We go, no. There was actually another major fish die-off in the 70s. There was another major fish die-off that's actually been recorded in the 60s. And there were these events that took place in the 50s. So Lake Apopka is, for me, it's been a poster child. But it's just that. It's a poster child. The fact is there's many, many lakes, not just in Florida, but there's many lakes throughout the United States and throughout the world that have undergone the same kind of issues. And one of the things that no one actually asked me this morning, which is always interesting, but I went a little long, they always say, what chemical is causing the problems at Lake Apopka? And people will say, well, DDE is the highest levels that we measure there. And I will tell folks, we've done studies to try and do DDE and replicate what we find. We can't, we don't get the replications. It's a mix. We call it the Lake Apopka mix. And the fact is that we are spending a lot of, I'm spending hundreds of thousands of dollars doing the highest end analytical chemistry we can get right now, most sophisticated stuff to try and get some idea of identifying the various chemicals that are there. So your point is I think very important. In anything episode like this, people are blamed. Now, I still think that the farms had an awful lot of contamination up there. I think there are issues with people who worked on those farms. I think there are issues in the lake. But I also don't think that Lake Apopka is all due to a single cause, a single event. This was actually a concerted effort by lots of people.
My name's Blade Malquist. I'm from Central Utah. Wanted to talk a little bit about the Clean Water Act. We have in Utah, we have a group from the Utah Department of Agriculture that has written a special exemption from the Clean Water Act, allowing them to give permits out to, for example, our mosquito spraying people and our weed department both have permits so that they can spray right up to the water with this stuff, even if it has our beautiful trout in it, you know, and everything else. And it's devastating to me when the United States Supreme Court said it's a biological hazard and is not to be in our waters. And the head of our county commission that's just did not seek re-election this last time, he's a farmer and a rancher. He has sent a special request that all the farmers be given an exemption to the Clean Water Act so that they can spray wherever they want in their fields, and if there's a stream by it, just spray it and do whatever they want. When we used to have fish through downtown Nephi, with the irrigation company now dries it up every year and runs at a different space, the mosquito spray truck would pull up and blast it into the stream and kill anything that was around, all of our aquatic insects. And I just wondered what your feeling is. We hear that this is being done in a lot of counties across the United States. And to me, it's alarming because the United States Supreme Court has spoken. We have such zealous people that spray our mosquitoes that for the last 10 years, they've been going up and down our streets 3 times a week and blasting permethrin into our homes. And we have 7 times the thyroid disease as the national average. And I bring that to the EPA, I bring it to the Department of Agriculture, and it's so what? You know, so they have to be on pills for the rest of your life. The way I discovered it is I have 55 neighbors with failed thyroids just in a few block radius around my home, including 3 of my daughters, you know, 2 of my daughters and another one that probably needs it. And so I thought I'd get your feelings. What do we do? How do I get the CDC to act on the fact that we have these endocrine disruptors, and how do I get them to obey the Clean Water Act? I especially wanted to bring the Clean Water Act to you people.
Well, a couple of things. The first is that, and this is not belaboring, but let me explain the difficulty. Thyroid disease in women is one of the most common described diseases. We don't know why. Well, I suspect why, because we've now described for the first time that the thyroid is chock full of estrogen receptor. And so women already probably have a preponderance, or at least a predisposition towards developing thyroid disease. So what I would actually argue to you, and this happens a lot, is that you see these clusters, and they're incredibly difficult to pin back to a single event in the past or something like that. The best way to do this is that if you can actually get either a local graduate student or somebody interested at one of the local universities to do a basic epidemiological study where you actually go in and actually not just assess you and your neighbors, because you probably, the problem always has been is that people show up at the same clinic and they say, well, I live 2 blocks from you. And then everybody says, this happened, for example, in not Staten Island, in Long Island with breast cancer. It's various kinds of things. So the first thing to do is try and get somebody that'll actually help you do kind of a science-based assessment. And that way, when you take it to them, you say, I have the rigorous approach. And there are scientists that are willing to do this. There's also scientists that'll blow you off. It's like everything else, right? I mean, yeah, we all met them. I mean, as I used to tell students when they would actually, I said, no, you got to go talk to your professor. Some of them are assholes, some of them aren't. I mean, they're human beings. So, I can give you 10 or 15, right? So, but the fact is that there are people who care. There are people who would be willing to sit down and talk to you. It's like trying to get funding. The only correlate is persistence. And so you just keep trying, right? Now, the second part for the Clean Water Act, I am not the person to speak. You should be probably down the hall talking to the lawyers. But the fact is that there are very specific ways that you can actually fight that, especially given the fact that they're asking for an exemption, which already exists, and they have to prove that that exemption is required for some reason. And usually the only exemption, and they don't give an exemption the only exemption is usually for not spraying, is because it's a public health threat. But vested interest is vested interest, and you will get people that are willing to do it, or a perceived public health threat. So their argument is, well, we have West Nile, we have this, we have that, so therefore we need to spray because mosquitoes are, in fact.
And that's why they're spraying.
Absolutely.
We've had one case in 10 years, and he came from out of the county.
Yeah.
We never had mosquitoes till we killed our
Right.
beneficials and our bats and our
Well,
birds left.
you are absolutely, that's the final point I was going to make. There's actually been a number of really interesting studies, and it's really hard to convince, for example, people in public health departments of this. But they did studies in Indonesia, in Africa, looking at malaria rates. And what they actually found was that the malaria rates in areas that had jungle, that is functional jungles, were basically orders of magnitude lower than, in fact, where they had actually cut everything down and they actually just had basic fields. And the reason is that you destroyed a functional ecosystem. So the only thing that literally was left was that you had no bats, you had nothing that was actually eating the mosquito larvae, nothing were controlling them other than the human activities of pesticides, for example. I work in Africa extensively, and one of the big things I battled there, which I don't know if you all know, DDT is still made and is still used. And the fact is that in Africa, what they'll tell you is that, well, we're not spraying it from airplanes. No, what they're doing is they're giving it to people, and they basically powder the inside of their huts with this for mosquitoes. So you walk into a native hut, and the walls are white, and it's DDT. And they say, well, we don't use it. We tell them they can't use it in agriculture, and you go, you're kidding me, right? I mean, the fact is, it actually kills mosquitoes. You don't think you're going to take it out and dust it on your plants too. So the take home is that a lot of it's education. A lot of it, why we're all here today, I think, quite honestly, is education, is understanding how do we educate our neighbors, how do we educate the people around us, because it's very easy to, well, we've seen it in this country, unfortunately, for decades now. It's very easy to do scare tactics. It's much harder to try and explain what's the scientific basis for why we need to, in fact, have functional ecosystems, why we need to have conservation, etc. So I don't think there's any magic bullet. At least I don't have any in the 25 years I've been fighting the
We
fight.
actually went to the Department of Health man for help, and he said, "Oh, you're just a bunch of liars because you're getting this stuff off the internet from Beyond Pesticides." But he put it in the paper that we said it was the least effective method of mosquito eradication, and they says the CDC says it's the least efficient, and they're synonyms, you know. And they won't take any more stuff from a paper from us because of the way he intimidated. We're going to all forms of government, including the EPA. We've waited 7 months for a response from them, and 5 years from the Department of Agriculture for the violation of all the label laws and the state and federal laws. When we met with the Department of Agriculture, the head man says, "We know people are getting sick and a few dozen will die, but this is big business and our sprayers need the money." And we asked them why they weren't enforcing the federal and state right to know laws. And they said, "We've decided not to enforce those laws at this time." And the man over the spraying, we asked him, he said actually said in the papers in Utah, "We will protect our sprayers at all costs." And we submitted 24 major multiple violations of state and federal law to the Utah Attorney Generals and to the Department of Agriculture, and have waited 5 years for promises and answers that have never come. And that's just from 1 year of the 10 years of spraying. So we're seeing, like here with Lake Apopka and everything else, we're seeing the same thing. Governments on any level are refusing to do anything because they don't want to be blamed for anything. Thank you.
That's right. I would just quickly add to that this, as you pointed out, is happening all over the country, and we know of an effort in particular in Washington State where invasive species are the evil number one, and they're giving general permits, waivers to use a lot of different pesticides on just for that reason. If that's your reason, go ahead and use it. And it's the same sort of thing.
Yeah. Got an exemption as they are spraying up on the Nebo Loop Road for the invasive species using Grazon P+D, which is piclorin and 2,4-D, for the Russian thistle, of which we don't have up there. We have native mountain thistle and native thistles. And I've got one place where they sprayed, and with 2,4-D, like the dandelions, it droops a little bit. They never die. Yeah. We had one 3 years ago, 8 2 years ago, and there are 13 on that spot. Yeah. And they're spraying 6, 7, 8 times a year, and they're only supposed to spray once every 2 years.
Yeah, you don't get rid of them.
The EPA knows it, and we've waited 7 months for it.
There will be another workshop this afternoon on this similar topic, and again, trying to get the focus more on the ecosystem and looking at all the different aspects of it, as Lou has so well said.
I'm Christopher Lewis. I'm a Orlando expatriate who finally came back to Orlando. I spent 38 years living in Southern California. I have a Bachelor of Arts, not a Bachelor of Science, a Bachelor of Arts in Geological Sciences from UC Santa Barbara, and I have a Master of Science in Environmental Hydrogeology from Cal State Los Angeles. So when I see events like this, I want to think in terms of a big picture, and so I think in terms of the geology time scale, because I am trained as a geologist. I did hydrogeology of gas stations, environmentally assessing gas stations in California, till we ran out of gas stations to assess. They're all assessed, so I'm retired, not by choice, but so when I think of the geologic timescale, I think of extinction events, and I'm looking at Wikipedia, and there have been 5 major extinction events identified in the fossil record. None of those extinction events were anthropogenic. In other words, they were not caused by humans. Humans did not exist back at the end of, let's say, the Permian, which is considered to be it's the largest extinction event found so far in the fossil record. It most likely will be the largest extinction event ever found in the fossil record. But yes, exactly. It is entirely possible the human race does have the ability to cause the human race to go extinct. We have to hope and pray that that is a wrong assertion, that the assertion that we will go extinct. But there are no guarantees that the human race itself will not caused by our collective stupidity, we could cause ourselves to go extinct. And with 7 billion plus people on the planet, that's a lot of conflict that can arise. So I do want to point out that vast numbers of species have gone extinct pretty much at the same point in time, and it can happen again. So it's a good thing to focus on Lake Apopka. It's a good thing to focus on dead zones that are off the coast of every human-occupied continent, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But to me, the big picture is that the human race has the power, and forget about nuclear bombs. That is one mechanism that humankind can take to cause the human race to go extinct. But just the fact that we are existing on this planet and we're ignoring the laws of thermodynamics as a general rule, we're ignoring those laws. We're ignoring a lot of scientific evidence in terms of mass behavior, and the only cure that I can see is mass education, reaching out to the conservatives, which they'll give us a lot of guff, most definitely, but a massive educational outreach to the people who tremble in fear, the people whose amygdala, the reptile brain, shows a lot of electrical activity. When they're listening to Rush Limbaugh and Sean Hannity, their amygdalas just go wild because they live in fear. But reaching out to those people with a massive educational campaign could well be the only hope.
Just two real comments. The first is that that's why this morning my talk and why most of my career has been focused on reproduction. The fact is that, as we all know, evolution is differential reproduction. And species cannot persist through time and space if they don't reproduce. So the fact is that there are species that will go extinct naturally. There are species that will go extinct because of our activities, just like there have been other species that probably went extinct by other organisms' activities. But the fact is, it is something we have to worry about. The second part, which is really interesting, is that there's a book out there that was published about 15 years ago, was something like The Making of a Conservative Conservationist. And it ends up that, as you may or may not know, the U.S. actually has a joint commission with Canada over the Great Lakes. And I can't remember the guy's last name. It starts with a D. It'll come to me. But the fact was, he was on the International Joint Commission. And he was actually one of the most gruff people. In fact, he actually helped Ronald Reagan get elected in the central part of the country, on and on. But then his grandkids started to get sick, and there were very specific sicknesses that actually were clearly associated with the environment. And he started to ask himself some serious questions. And his philosophy was, being a conservative, doesn't that mean we're supposed to be conserving things? And maybe the most important things, we're conserving our kids and our grandkids. And so I actually had some really interesting conversations with him. So I think it is possible, but of course, the minute he was converted to a conservationist, he was no longer a conservative by the political parties. So,
what positive actions have we seen?
I think well, for me, a couple of things. The first is that we've started to realize, as I spoke this morning, that disease is not due to a mutation you inherit from mom or dad, and there's nothing you can do about it. So the take home is that if the environment is playing such a huge role in setting up potential diseases, or more importantly, potential for disease, it doesn't cause disease, then lifestyle, environment, the choices we make about ourselves and our kids will have a fundamental impact on the health of ourselves and our kids and our grandkids. So that's a completely different mindset than existed a decade ago, where it was what it was. You inherited what you inherited. You swore at your mom and dad for whatever they did, but there was nothing you could do. So that's point number one. Point number two is that I have personally seen a tremendous groundswell among women about interest in the environment and their children, and a desire for this education. And so, as I mentioned this morning, guys on for various reasons, mostly testosterone poisoning, we are much slower to learn, and it takes us an awful lot more time to get there. But kidding aside, the fact that women are interested, the fact that women are actually trying to make a difference and get this education, I think is going to make a fundamental difference in this country. They're the ones that do the most purchasing. So decisions about organics or non-organics, that's coming from the home front. And so there's actually an economic basis for all of this, and that's being driven by women.
I'm Debbie Saki from Seminole State College. I teach biology, and thank you for coming. I became aware of your work through Withgott's environmental science textbook, and I noticed in the last edition he kind of diminishes the human element in terms of the estrogen mimics. In the previous edition, he extrapolated and said, you know, it's possible that these affect human health, and he's really come back down on that argument, which is opposite to what you told us this morning. So I was wondering if you could recommend a book that discusses the biology of the estrogen mimics in terms of, like, I was understanding what you said was that the aromatase reduces the estrogen. So if you reduces testosterone, so if the chemicals reduce the estrogen concentrations, how do these chemicals also mimic estrogen?
Great. That's the point that I made this morning, is that endocrine disruption is not one mechanism. The endocrine system, as you know, has a whole series of things. So endocrine disruptors can do a number of things. One, we have endocrine disruptors like BPA that are estrogenic. And what we mean by that is it binds the estrogen receptor and mimics the hormone. We also have endocrine disruptors that basically, for example, block aromatase expression. Then it's actually anti-estrogenic. One of the problems is the dogma itself that's actually been generated in endocrine disruption field is that this all came out of environmental estrogens early on. And so everyone now thinks it's like climate change, right? We talk about global warming. So everyone says, well, geez, we had the coldest winter I've ever had. There's no global warming. So it's like, well, geez, how can you actually have EDCs are estrogens? But no. They're anti-androgens, they're androgens. They're anti-estrogens, they're estrogens. They're anti-thyroidal, they're thyroidal. We're now finding they're having all kinds of effects on the immune system, on inflammation, anti-inflammation, all these kinds of things. So the hard part goes back to how do you integrate that signal? Lake Apopka has 5 or 6 estrogens we've identified. It has several anti-estrogens we've identified. It has several anti-androgens we've identified. We suspect now that we've now discovered for the first time anti-progestins, which actually then would cause miscarriage, things like that. It's all a soup. And so it depends upon when are you exposed, how are you exposed, and how much were you exposed. So I hate to say, not give you a definitive answer, but the take home. And what's happened is that the literature for animals is incredibly powerful, but there's a straw man set up here. Remember what I said this morning during my talk, if you were there, is that just because you have association doesn't mean you have causation. And so what will happen is people will stand up and say, well, we don't have any proof that smoking causes cancer. Do you realize that's true? Why? Because we don't raise little boys and little girls under controlled conditions and make half of them smoke and half of them not smoke to do causation. That's causation as a scientist. Now, is there an association? Hell yes. And do we have wildlife or, in fact, lab animals that basically say the things we're seeing in humans are endocrine disruptor based? The CDC now actually, the NIH now actually has a list of endocrine disruptors that we know in animals and wildlife, and they even have a slide or they have data now on which things are definitive kind of in humans. And of course, one of the classic ones is pharmaceutics, things like DES and Trenbolone, things like that. So, sorry. Hopefully explain that.
For those who are interested in working with the next generation, I do a program in schools called Climate Change is Elementary, going around working with kids, because I think if we don't get the kids in this generation, we've lost it all. So we're going to take that nationwide. Right now it's only in 6 states. But I'm also a Floridian, and I know a lot of people are not, so we've been kind of Florida-centric here, and I don't want to bore everybody with Florida. But we have something called well, and I'm a Berkeley grad, so what can I say? Master's in public health education, so I'm very interested in this topic. But I live in Osceola County, Florida, and we have a soil and water conservation board, as does every county in Florida. And it seems to me that those soil and water conservation boards are relatively ineffective and aren't doing anything. They're citizen staffed, but they have no funding. They aren't paid, they're volunteers, and they only have, it seems to me, a bit of authority, and it's only over the agricultural area where they rubber stamp whatever the Department of Agriculture wants them to rubber stamp, and they don't have any impact whatsoever in the urban area. I live in Celebration, which is the Disney town, and I say it's the most polluted town in America because of what they require us to do to have green lawns. Right. And of course the spray truck comes through every night, and I've never swatted a mosquito, and I live in Florida. So my question is, how do we move from research to action with regard to control of pesticides, herbicides, fungicides in Florida, in these counties that are nominally advised by soil and water conservation boards that are toothless and not really doing what they're supposed to do?
Well, very simple for me. You do exactly what you guys are doing today. The only way we can two things have happened in the United States. The first is we've lost our ability to translate science to the public through newspapers. So the newspapers have actually lost their science reporters. There's no longer that realm there. And the problem is that some of that has been translated to the web, and there are great sites that have some of that, but there's also, as we know, sites where you can make up anything you want to make up, and it's there, and it's considered to be equal. My fundamental belief is what you just talked about. It has to be education. Has to be education of kids. Has to be education of young adults. Has to be education of moms and dads. Yeah. Most important, it has to be education of women. Okay? I fundamentally believe that. It's been proven in Africa. It's been proven in Indonesia and in Asia. It's been proven in South and Central America. You educate women, and you will change a whole community. You educate men, and testosterone gets in the way.